Hey everyone, and welcome to Module 2. I just wanted to give a few tips and suggestions for this week and just give a very brief overview for everyone in terms of what to expect in this module. So we're going to focus this week primarily on voting rights, but the module is going to start with some discussion on the policy process. So it's going to have an overview of things like how a bill becomes a law, and give us all a sense of just what the legislative process is, which is very important for us to be aware of because this class is all about advocacy, right? And you can't really advocate for legislative change unless you know quite a bit about the legislative process. So we're going to start there and just ground ourselves in a really foundational understanding of what the policy and legislative process is. And then we'll switch gears and focus on voting rights. And you may be wondering, like, why are we talking about voting rights? Why is this relevant to advocacy work? Or maybe you're not, maybe it's apparent to you. But from my perspective, it's so important to be have a very clear understanding of voting rights for a few reasons. One is that who votes matters tremendously. So understanding what the barriers are that are in place, often intentionally, to keep some folks from being able to vote or to make it harder for people to vote, are really important to understand because they have an impact on who is actually showing up at the polls. And then who's showing up at the polls can have a pretty drastic impact on who is elected, and then what laws are put in place. So it's important to know this because who votes matters tremendously. It shapes what we have as policy quite a bit. It's also really important for us to understand voting rights because not everyone has had voting rights, or even not everyone has voting rights right now. So as a woman, right, a few generations back in America, I wouldn't have had the right to vote. People who are Black or African American often face and have faced until very recently significant barriers to voting, threats of violence, poll taxes, things that are really important, again, to understand because it, again, has an impact in just our own sort of understanding of why those barriers are in place and what the impacts of them are. It's also important because oftentimes the clients that we're working with are vulnerable or marginalized populations who themselves might be facing challenges in terms of getting to the polls and voting. So being clear about what your role as a social worker is to have a positive change on the ability of our clients to vote is super important. One of the first things that I did when I was in graduate school quite a while ago was organize a voter registration event at a local homeless shelter where I was working. And that was one of the most powerful experiences that I had as a graduate student and frankly as a social worker, because the folks that I would interact with at this voter registration event were oftentimes surprised that they could vote, right? Some folks may have had prior experience in jail or corrections and thought that their right to vote was gone forever. But I knew that there were, again, things that were in place in Connecticut, which is where I was having the event, that did allow people to regain their right to vote. So that knowledge about what voting rights are and what the voting laws are and what sort of ability people have to regain voting rights if they've lost them is going to be really valuable to you as a social worker. So you have two assignments this week that you need to focus on. One is a discussion post on voting. Be sure that by the end of be sure that by the assignment due date that's in the calendar for that voting discussion, that your original post has been submitted. Secondly, make sure that by the end of Module 2, which is the end of the day the following Saturday, that you have responded to 2 of your peers' posts. I always wait to do grading until the end of the module for that very reason, and that's to make sure that everyone has time to get both their post in and the response to 2 peers. What you're going to write in your post is just a 1-page letter to another social work student that describes, again, sort of your understanding of voting rights and your understanding of the role that social workers play in having an impact on voting rights. So for this discussion post, I really want you to think about what you've learned from Module 2 in terms of the videos and the articles that are all about voting rights, and really again, in a letter format, write to another social work student and really educate them on what some challenges are to a particular vulnerable population in terms of their voting rights. And again, what you as a social worker can do to impact and to improve their access to voting rights. So pick a vulnerable population, ideally the one that you're focused on for your project, but doesn't have to be, just any vulnerable population. Write about challenges they face in voting, and then write about the role of social workers in that one-page letter. Make sure that you put in APA citations where needed in that letter, and again, respond to two peers' posts. The last discussion, or last assignment, I should say, for this module is going to be a voting assignment where you're going to create a flyer. You have a couple options. You can create a flyer about what your local voting laws and processes are, where people can go to vote. It's really intended to be an informational flyer that you would publish, so just one page for that one as well. And when you're doing the flyer, don't worry about APA formatting, but do make sure that you put in citations where needed. So if you're citing data, quotes, anything that you'd normally cite, just make sure you include those links where necessary. The other option that you have is that you could make a flyer about, again, sort of not necessarily local voting rights, but a flyer that's targeted towards a particular population to help them understand what their voting rights are and help them really engage in the voting process. So the intention for that flyer is really for it to be informational, right? So it's not like a long paper that you're writing or anything like that. It's just information to share with either, again, sort of anyone, if you're talking about voting rights in your community and talking about like where to go to register to vote and what the process is, or to choose, again, one of those special populations that's going to be in the Lane text in Chapter 8 and talk about a voter education product or project for that particular population. And then what your flyer would really be a description of that voter education event, right? So I described one that I did when I was in grad school. Do something super creative. Think about how you would do that sort of thing. Like, how would you advertise it to folks? That's the intention behind that second assignment. If you have questions about either assignment or anything in Module 2, please reach out to me at any point. Shoot me an email. Best way to reach me. We'll get back to you on those within 24 hours. Easiest usually to send them in Canvas, but I always check my Outlook as well. And then if it's helpful to talk at any point, you can do that by just, again, reaching out, and I will go ahead and get a one-on-one meeting for us scheduled so we can touch base. Hope you're having a good week and had a restful weekend, and I look forward to hearing from you throughout the week. Take care.